They thought they were stopping a suspicious passenger, but they were actually stopping the only person who could prevent what was coming next. Ava Carter stood perfectly still as the cold metal pressed against her wrists, the sharp click of the cuffs echoing louder than the overhead announcements humming through JFK Terminal 4, and around her, travelers slowed, some pretending not to stare, others openly watching as Officer Daniel Brooks held her arm with firm authority, his posture rigid, his voice carrying just enough for nearby ears to catch. "Ma'am, you need to come with me." And there it was, that subtle shift in tone, not loud, not aggressive, but filled with something heavier, something that had followed Ava her entire life. The quiet assumption that she didn't belong, that she was out of place in a world she had spent years protecting. But Ava didn't resist. She didn't argue. She simply let her eyes move, slow and deliberate, scanning the terminal like a map only she could read, because while Brooks saw a delay, she saw a countdown, and above them, glowing in harsh white light, the departure board ticked closer to boarding, 7 minutes, 12 seconds, and counting, and somewhere in that sea of rolling suitcases and tired faces, a threat was moving, unnoticed, unchallenged, except by her. Except now she was the one being pulled away. "You fit the description," Brooks added, his grip tightening just slightly as if to reinforce control, but Ava's expression didn't crack, not even for a second, because she had heard that before. Different words, same meaning, and behind them, a child asked a question, a mother whispered for silence, a businessman paused mid-step, and the entire terminal seemed to hold its breath without knowing why. Because tension like this didn't need explanation, it just needed a spark, and Ava could feel it building, not from fear, but from time slipping through her fingers. She shifted her gaze, just for a fraction of a second, toward a man seated near gate B12, gray hoodie, black carry-on placed carefully at his feet. Too carefully, his hands resting on top of it like he didn't trust the world to leave it alone. And that was the moment, the smallest detail, the kind most people would miss. But not her, never her, because Ava Carter wasn't just another passenger, and she wasn't just another woman being stopped in an airport for no reason. But Brooks didn't know that, not yet. To him, she was just another situation to control, another checkmark on a long shift. And as he turned to guide her toward the security office, his radio crackled faintly at his shoulder, a voice trying to break through, urgent, layered with something that didn't belong in routine calls, something sharper, something real, but Brooks ignored it, just for a second too long, and Ava closed her eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in calculation, because she knew exactly how much time was left and exactly what would happen if she didn't get free. And when she opened them again, there was something different in them now, something colder, something certain, because the next move wouldn't just change her fate, it would change his too. Officer Brooks barely glanced at the radio on his shoulder as the static sharpened into a voice, distorted but urgent, repeating his badge number, repeating it again like it mattered more than anything else happening in that moment. But to him, it was just noise, just another interruption in a long shift filled with routine stops and quick judgments. And he tightened his grip slightly, guiding Ava forward through the sliding glass doors toward the security office tucked just beyond the main terminal, while behind them the hum of the airport continued like nothing was wrong, like the world had not just tilted off balance by a few critical minutes. And Ava walked without resistance, her steps measured, controlled, her breathing steady even as her mind raced faster than the departure board above gate B12, now flashing 5 minutes and 48 seconds. And she did not need to look again to know the man in the gray hoodie had not moved, because men like that did not panic. They waited, they blended, they trusted the system to ignore them. And right now the system was doing exactly that, focusing all its attention on the wrong person. "You should have just cooperated from the start," Brooks muttered, not looking at her, his tone firm but almost casual, like this was already decided, like her role in this moment had already been written for her. But Ava's voice came calm, even, cutting through the tension without rising. "You are looking in the wrong direction." And for a brief second, just a fraction of a second, Brooks hesitated, not because he believed her, but because of how she said it, not defensive, not afraid, but certain, and certainty like that did not fit the narrative he had already built in his head. He shook it off, pushing open the door to the restricted corridor where the bright lights turned colder, harsher, the kind of lighting that stripped away comfort and left only control. "Everyone says that," he replied, dismissing her words before they could settle, but behind him the radio crackled. Again, louder now, sharper. "Officer Brooks, stand down immediately." And this time the command carried weight, enough to make the nearby TSA agent glance over, enough to make Brooks stop mid-step, his jaw tightening as he slowly reached for the radio, pressing it closer. "Control, repeat that," he said, his voice steady but edged with irritation, and Ava watched him carefully, not with triumph, not with relief, but with urgency, because even now, even with the shift beginning, time was still slipping, and somewhere beyond those walls a boarding announcement echoed faintly, "Final call approaching, final chance closing," and Brooks listened as the voice on the other end spoke again. Clearer now, unmistakable, confirming a name, confirming a status, confirming something that did not align with the woman standing in front of him in simple clothes and restrained hands. And his eyes moved to her for the first time, not with assumption, but with doubt, real doubt, the kind that breaks through instinct and forces reconsideration. "Who are you?" he asked, quieter now, the authority still there, but no longer absolute. And Ava did not answer immediately. She let the silence stretch just long enough to make the moment heavier, just long enough for the realization to begin forming on its own, because some truths did not need to be spoken loudly to be understood, and when she finally moved, it was slow, deliberate, reaching carefully into her coat as Brooks watched, every muscle tense, every expectation unraveling piece by piece. And in that narrow corridor, under those unforgiving lights, the balance of power began to shift, not with force, not with noise, but with something far more dangerous, the truth revealing itself 1 second too late. The movement of her hand was slow enough to calm him, but deliberate enough to command his full attention, and when Ava Carter pulled the slim leather case from inside her coat, the air in the corridor seemed to tighten, like even the lights above were waiting, and she flipped it open with a quiet precision that did not match the situation he thought he was controlling, revealing a badge that did not need explanation, the gold catching the sterile light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Counterterrorism Division. And for a moment Officer Brooks did not move, did not speak, because the reality in front of him did not fit the version of events he had already committed to, the version where he was right, where he was in control, where she was just another problem to solve. And the radio in his hand filled the silence with a voice now unmistakably firm, confirming her name, confirming her clearance level, confirming everything he had just dismissed. "This is a priority clearance individual. You are to release immediately." And the words did not echo. They landed, heavy, final, and Brooks felt it. The shift, the ground beneath his certainty cracking just enough to let doubt rush in, and his grip loosened, not fully, not yet, but enough for Ava to pull her wrists slightly free, enough to remind him that control was no longer his to hold. And she stepped closer, her voice still calm, but now edged with urgency that no longer needed to hide. "We do not have time for this," she said, her eyes locking onto his with a focus that cut through everything else. "Gate B12, gray hoodie, black carry-on, he has not moved in over 6 minutes." And Brooks blinked, processing, trying to catch up to a reality that had already moved ahead of him. And somewhere in the terminal a final boarding call echoed faintly, the sound sharper now, more urgent, like a clock hitting its last few seconds, and Ava continued, not louder, not more aggressive, but faster, each word placed with purpose. "If he boards that plane, you lose him in the system, and whatever he is carrying goes with him." And that was the moment it clicked, not fully, not cleanly, but enough for Brooks to see past the situation he thought he understood, enough to feel the weight of what could happen if he hesitated again, and his hands moved quickly now, unlocking the cuffs with a metallic snap that sounded different this time, not like control, but like release. And Ava did not wait. She did not thank him. She did not look back. She moved, fast, purposeful, already dialing a number as she stepped past him and into the open terminal, her voice low as she spoke into the phone, relaying updates, confirming positions, and Brooks stood there for a fraction of a second longer, the badge still fresh in his mind, the words from the radio still echoing. And then he turned, following her, not leading anymore, not deciding, just trying to keep up, and ahead of them the crowd shifted, unaware, ordinary, while somewhere within it a single person remained still, waiting, and the distance between action and consequence had never felt thinner, because now the question was no longer whether Ava belonged there, but whether they were already too late. The terminal opened up in front of them like a living maze of motion and noise, rolling suitcases echoing across polished floors, overhead announcements blending into a constant hum, and Ava Carter moved through it with precision, her pace steady but urgent, her eyes locked ahead as if everything else had faded into background static, while Officer Brooks followed just a step behind, no longer in control but no longer detached either, his gaze scanning now, trying to see what she saw, trying to catch the details he had missed, and above gate B12 the digital board flashed final call in sharp red letters, the countdown nearly gone, and there he was, exactly where she said he would be, gray hoodie, black carry-on placed at his feet, still as before, too still for someone about to board a flight, and Ava slowed just slightly, not stopping, not hesitating, but adjusting, her voice low as she spoke into the phone, confirming visual, confirming position, while her free hand subtly signaled to a nearby agent who had just stepped into view, plainclothes but unmistakable awareness in his posture. And Brooks felt it then, the shift in the air, the quiet coordination happening around him, invisible to everyone else, but suddenly clear to him, like stepping into a conversation that had already started long before he arrived. And for the first time he saw the man not as just another passenger, but as a focal point, a center of tension that did not belong in a place like this. And Ava's voice cut softly through the moment, not directed at him, not needing to be. "Watch his hands," she said, calm, controlled, and Brooks nodded without realizing it, his focus narrowing, the noise of the terminal fading as his attention locked onto the smallest movements, the way the man's fingers rested too firmly on the bag, the way his eyes avoided scanning the gate like everyone else. And then the boarding line shifted forward, passengers stepping one by one toward the gate agent, and the man stood, finally, lifting the bag with a careful grip that spoke louder than any alarm, and Ava moved, not rushing, not drawing attention, just closing the distance with a quiet certainty that made the moment feel suspended, and Brooks stayed in step, no longer questioning, no longer leading, just following the direction she set, and around them life continued, unaware, ordinary, while something far more significant unfolded just beneath the surface, and Ava's voice dropped even lower as she reached the edge of the line. "Now," she said, and in that single word the entire situation aligned, agents stepping into position, the man pausing as if sensing the shift too late, and Brooks felt the weight of it all hit him at once, not as fear, not as panic, but as realization that the person he had stopped minutes ago had been the only one who truly saw what was coming. And as Ava stepped forward, her presence calm but undeniable, the moment balanced on a single decision, one that would determine whether this ended quietly or echoed far beyond the walls of that terminal. The moment did not explode. It tightened, like the entire terminal had drawn a breath and refused to let it go. And Ava Carter stepped forward into that fragile space with a calm that did not match the urgency ticking beneath it, her eyes fixed on the man as he adjusted his grip on the black carry-on, his movements careful, controlled, but no longer unnoticed, and she spoke, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a clarity that cut through the noise around them. "Sir, I need you to step out of the line for a moment." And for a second he did not respond, his gaze flickering between her and the gate ahead, calculating, measuring, deciding, and behind him the line shifted again, a quiet impatience building as travelers checked their watches, unaware they were standing inches away from something far more serious than a delayed departure. And Brooks stood just behind Ava, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but alert with focus, his eyes now trained on the same details she had seen minutes ago, the tension in the man's shoulders, the way he held the bag just slightly away from his body as if protecting it. And Ava took one more step closer, closing the distance just enough to make the moment real. "We just need a quick check," she added, her tone steady, giving him a choice without giving him an escape. And that was when the shift happened, subtle but undeniable, the man's expression tightening for the briefest moment, a flicker of something behind his eyes that did not belong in an ordinary interaction, and Ava saw it. She had been waiting for it, that tiny crack where intention revealed itself, and her voice dropped just enough to carry only to him. "It is over," she said, not as a threat, not as a challenge, but as a fact, and around them the plainclothes agents moved closer, not rushing, not drawing attention, just narrowing the space until there was nowhere left to disappear, and Brooks felt it again, that realization settling deeper, heavier, that this was never about control, never about authority. It was about seeing what others ignored, about understanding what others dismissed, and the man slowly lowered the bag to the ground, his movements deliberate, his resistance fading not under force but under certainty, and Ava did not look away, not for a second, maintaining that unbroken line of focus until the tension finally released, not with noise, not with chaos, but with a quiet shift that most people around them would never even notice, a situation resolved before it could become something else, something worse. And as the agent stepped in to take over, Ava exhaled softly, the first sign of release she had allowed herself, and Brooks stood there, watching, the weight of everything settling into place. Every second he had wasted replaying in his mind, every assumption now exposed for what it was, and Ava turned slightly, her eyes meeting his for just a brief moment, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more cutting, clarity, and without saying a word. She made him understand exactly what had happened, exactly what almost happened, and as the boarding line resumed and the terminal returned to its normal rhythm, Brooks remained still for a second longer, realizing that the biggest mistake he had made was not stopping the wrong person, it was failing to recognize the right one when it mattered most. The agents moved with quiet efficiency, guiding the man away from the boarding line without raising voices or drawing attention. And within seconds the space he had occupied blended back into the rhythm of the terminal, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Passengers stepping forward, scanning boarding passes, continuing their journeys unaware of how close they had come to something far more serious. And Ava Carter stood still for a brief moment, her eyes following the direction the man had been taken, her mind already shifting ahead, connecting pieces that extended far beyond this single moment. Because situations like this were never isolated, never random. They were part of something larger, something that did not end just because one person had been stopped, and she lifted her phone again, her voice low as she spoke, confirming status, requesting immediate follow-up, her tone precise, controlled, but carrying a weight that signaled this was only the beginning, and behind her officer Brooks remained where he was, his posture no longer defined by authority but by reflection, his gaze drifting from the now ordinary boarding line to Ava, trying to reconcile the image he had formed earlier with the reality that had just unfolded in front of him. And for the first time, he noticed the details he had overlooked before, the composure in her stance, the clarity in her decisions, the way she had seen what no one else had. And he stepped forward slowly, as if unsure whether he belonged in this part of the situation anymore. "I did not know," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the certainty it carried before, and Ava turned slightly, her expression calm, not cold, not forgiving, just clear. "That is the problem," she replied, not with accusation but with truth, and the words settled heavier than any reprimand could have, because they were not about this moment alone. They were about every moment like it, every assumption made too quickly, every judgment formed without understanding, and Brooks nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition, the kind that comes too late to change what has already happened, and Ava looked back toward the gate, the last few passengers now boarding, the door preparing to close, and for a second the weight of the countdown lingered in the air, a reminder of how close everything had come, and she exhaled slowly, steadying herself before turning away, already moving toward the next step. Because her work did not end with recognition or apology, it moved forward, always. Forward, following threads others could not see yet. And as she disappeared into the flow of the terminal, Brooks remained behind, the noise returning around him, announcements echoing, footsteps passing, life continuing as it always did. But something in him had shifted, something quiet but permanent. And as he glanced once more toward Gate B12, now closing, he understood something he had never considered before. that sometimes the most dangerous mistake is not what you do, but what you fail to see when it matters most. The terminal did not slow down for reflection. It never did. And as Ava Carter moved past the gate area, the world around her continued in its steady rhythm, announcements echoing overhead, wheels rolling across polished floors, voices blending into a constant hum. But her focus had already shifted beyond what had just happened, because for her this was not an ending, it was a signal, a fragment of something larger that had just revealed itself for a brief moment before disappearing again. And she walked with purpose, her phone pressed lightly to her ear as she spoke in low, precise tones, confirming that the subject had been secured, requesting immediate analysis on the contents of the bag, cross-checking flight manifests, tracing connections that extended far beyond this airport. Because threats like this did not operate alone, they moved in patterns, in networks, in layers that required more than a single interception to understand. And as she turned down a quieter corridor away from the main terminal, the bright lights softened slightly, the noise fading just enough to allow clarity to settle in, and she paused for a second, not out of hesitation but calculation, replaying every detail, every movement, every second lost. And behind her, far enough to not interrupt, but close enough to follow, Officer Brooks walked with a different pace now, no longer driven by authority but by something heavier, awareness, and he watched her as she moved, noticing the way she carried the situation forward without pause, without acknowledgement of what had just been corrected, because for her there was no time to dwell, only time to act, and that realization stayed with him as he stepped closer, stopping just short of her path, unsure of what to say, unsure of what right he had to speak at all. But Ava ended the call and looked at him briefly, her expression unchanged, steady, and he took a breath before speaking. "If I had not stopped you," he began, the sentence unfinished because he did not need to complete it. The outcome was already clear, and Ava held his gaze for a moment, not with judgment, not with sympathy, but with something more precise, perspective. "Than we would have been earlier," she said simply, and the words landed without force yet carried more weight than anything else in that moment, because they were not about blame, they were about consequence, about the cost of a delay measured not in minutes, but in opportunity. And Brooks nodded slowly, understanding that this was not a lesson delivered for comfort, it was one delivered for change, and Ava turned away again, already moving, already continuing forward into the next phase of something he could not yet see. And as she disappeared around the corner, blending into a part of the airport most people never noticed, Brooks remained standing there for a second longer, the noise of the terminal returning around him, but no longer sounding the same, because now every movement, every face, every moment carried a different weight, a different question, one he had never asked before. What am I missing? And somewhere beyond his view, beyond the corridor, beyond the immediate reach of this moment, Ava Carter stepped into a world where answers were never obvious and time was never enough, already preparing for what came next, because in her world, stopping one threat was never the end. It was only the beginning of understanding how many more were still unseen. The hallway narrowed as Ava Carter stepped into a secured operations room tucked behind layers of restricted access, the kind of place where noise from the outside world faded into a distant echo and everything inside moved with quiet precision, screens glowing with live feeds, data streaming in real time, agents speaking in low tones that carried urgency without chaos. And she did not slow as she entered, handing off the situation with a few concise words that immediately shifted attention across the room. The black carry-on now isolated on a central table under careful observation, its significance no longer just a suspicion but a confirmed priority. And Ava moved to the nearest console, her eyes scanning the incoming data, cross-referencing timestamps, passenger lists, recent communications, building a larger picture piece by piece, because what had happened at the gate was only a fragment, a single thread in something far more complex. And she leaned slightly closer to the screen, her voice steady as she spoke. "Run connections on all recent arrivals matching his pattern. Focus on coordinated movement, not individual anomalies." And the agent beside her nodded immediately, fingers already moving across the keyboard, because in this room hesitation did not exist. Only action, only response. and behind her the door opened quietly, and Officer Brooks stepped in, stopping just inside, as if crossing an invisible boundary, his presence out of place yet no longer unwelcome. And he looked around, taking in the environment, the coordination, the scale of what he had nearly disrupted without even realizing it. And Ava did not turn immediately, but she was aware of him, aware of his presence, of what it represented, and after a moment she spoke without looking back. "You should see this." And Brooks stepped closer, his eyes drawn to the screen where a map of interconnected flights, names, and timelines began to form, lines linking cities, patterns emerging that did not exist to someone who was not trained to see them. And Ava pointed to a sequence of movements, subtle, spread out, but connected in a way that made the situation far more serious than a single interception. "He was not alone," she said, her tone calm, but carrying a weight that shifted the room's focus even further, and Brooks felt it again, that realization expanding, not just about what had happened, but about what it meant, that the moment at the gate had not been an isolated mistake. It had been a narrow interruption in something still unfolding. And Ava continued, her voice low but precise. "We stopped one piece, but the rest of the pattern is still active," and the room adjusted instantly, agents redirecting, new data being pulled, the situation evolving in real time. And Brooks stood there, watching, understanding now that the world he operated in, the one defined by immediate control and visible action, was only a small part of a much larger system where the real threats were often invisible until someone knew exactly where to look. And Ava finally turned slightly, her eyes meeting his not with judgment, but with clarity. "This is why details matter," she said, and then she turned back to the screen, already moving forward, already several steps ahead, because for her the moment at the airport was already behind her, and what mattered now was what came next, because somewhere beyond that room, beyond those screens, the rest of the story was still unfolding, and time, once again, was already running out. The room did not feel larger as more data filled the screens. It felt tighter, as if every new connection pulled the walls closer together, and Ava Carter stood at the center of it, her eyes moving across the web of information as it expanded in real time, flight numbers linking to passenger manifests, timestamps aligning in patterns that were too precise to be coincidence. And she traced one line with her finger across the display, from New York to Chicago, from Chicago to Dallas, and then branching outward in a way that suggested coordination, not randomness, and her voice remained steady as she spoke. "These movements are staggered on purpose, not to avoid detection, but to delay recognition." And the agent beside her nodded, already adjusting filters, refining the data to highlight overlaps that would not be obvious to an untrained eye. And behind them Officer Brooks watched in silence, his earlier certainty now replaced with something more uncomfortable, the awareness of how much he had missed, how easily he had reduced a situation to something simple when it was anything but. And Ava shifted her attention to another screen where a list of names scrolled slowly, each one connected by subtle indicators, shared bookings, last-minute changes, synchronized check-ins that aligned too perfectly to ignore. And she leaned closer, her focus narrowing. "Look at the timing," she said, her tone low but precise. "They are not trying to hide, they are trying to blend." And that distinction changed everything, because hiding could be searched for. But blending required a different kind of attention, the kind that saw patterns instead of individuals. And Brooks stepped closer, his eyes following the lines on the screen, trying to understand what she saw so clearly. And for a moment the noise of the room faded again, replaced by the quiet intensity of realization. Because this was not about one person at one gate. It was about a system moving beneath the surface, unnoticed until someone knew exactly where to look. And Ava straightened slightly, her expression unchanged but her pace quickening. "We need to flag every connected passenger before departure clearance," she said. And immediately the room shifted again, agents redirecting, calls being placed, alerts being sent across networks that extended far beyond the airport. And Brooks felt the scale of it then, not just the complexity, but the responsibility, the weight of decisions made in seconds that could ripple far beyond this moment. And Ava turned her head just enough to glance at him, not fully, just enough to acknowledge his presence. "This is what a delay costs," she said quietly, and the words did not accuse. they informed. They placed his earlier actions into a context that could not be ignored, and Brooks nodded slowly, absorbing it, understanding now that in this world, time was not measured in minutes, it was measured in consequences, and Ava turned back to the screens, already moving forward, already tracking the next step, because somewhere within that network, somewhere beyond what they had already uncovered, there was still a missing piece, something that had not yet revealed itself. And as the lines on the screen continued to expand, one connection remained incomplete, one path unresolved, and Ava's eyes fixed on it, her voice lowering slightly as she spoke. There is one more. And in that moment the room seemed to hold its breath again, because whatever they had stopped so far was only part of something that was not finished yet. The room fell into a quieter kind of tension, not loud, not chaotic, but sharper, more focused, as Ava Carter isolated the final unresolved line on the screen, a single thread that did not fully connect yet somehow held the entire pattern together, and she stepped closer, her eyes narrowing slightly as she followed its path across the data, from a last-minute ticket purchase to a delayed check-in, then to a gate assignment that had just changed within the last 10 minutes. And that detail alone was enough to make her pause, because changes like that were never random at this stage, not when everything else had been so precisely timed, and she spoke without turning, her voice calm, but carrying a new urgency. Pull up all recent gate reassignments in the last 15 minutes, and the agent beside her moved instantly, fingers moving across the keyboard as new information flooded the screen. And within seconds the pattern shifted, revealing something that had been hidden in plain sight, not by absence, but by movement, and Ava saw it immediately. The missing piece, not a person waiting to board, but a person who had already moved, already adjusted, already reacted to the disruption at Gate B12, and her voice dropped slightly, more focused now. He adapted, she said, and the room seemed to tighten around that realization, because adaptation meant awareness, and awareness meant this was no longer just a coordinated pattern, it was a responsive one, and behind her Officer Brooks felt it too, the shift from control to chase, from understanding to urgency, and he stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the screen as the new data aligned, revealing a second passenger linked through timing, not identity, someone who had changed gates just minutes after the first interception, someone who was now moving toward a different departure point entirely, and Ava traced the new path with her finger, her mind already calculating distance, time, access points. Gate C19, she said, and without hesitation the room responded, calls going out, alerts being redirected, agents repositioning across the terminal, because the situation had just expanded beyond a single location, and Ava turned quickly, already moving toward the door, her pace faster now, more direct, and Brooks followed immediately, no longer questioning his place, no longer hesitating, because now he understood what was at stake, not in theory, not in assumption, but in real time. And as they stepped back into the corridor, the noise of the airport rushed in again, louder now, more chaotic, as if the world outside had continued moving forward while they had uncovered something it could not yet see. And Ava moved through it with purpose, her eyes scanning ahead, recalculating with every step, because time had shifted again, the countdown no longer tied to one gate, one person, but to a moving target that was already adjusting, already slipping through the system. And Brooks kept pace beside her, his focus sharper than before, his attention no longer on control, but on understanding. And as they turned toward the direction of Gate C19, Ava spoke quietly, almost to herself, but loud enough for him to hear. This one knows. And those words carried a different kind of weight, because this was no longer about stopping something unseen, it was about catching something that was already aware it was being watched, and somewhere ahead, beyond the crowds, beyond the noise, the final piece of the pattern was already moving, and the distance between them was closing faster than either of them could afford to miscalculate. The distance to Gate C19 felt shorter than it should have been and longer than they could afford, the crowd thickening as Ava Carter moved through it with precision, her path cutting cleanly between travelers who had no idea they were standing in the middle of something far bigger than delayed flights or boarding lines. And Officer Brooks stayed close behind, his attention sharper now, his eyes no longer drifting but actively searching, trying to match the pace of someone who was already 3 steps ahead of every situation. and ahead of them the overhead sign for Gate C-19 came into view, glowing in steady white letters that felt almost too calm for what was unfolding beneath it. And Ava slowed just enough to scan the area, her gaze sweeping across faces, movements, patterns, not looking for panic, but for control, for the absence of normal behavior. Because people who knew they were being watched did not act nervous, they acted deliberate, and she saw it. Not immediately, not obviously, but in the way one man stood slightly outside the boarding line, his posture relaxed but his eyes too aware, tracking movement without appearing to, his carry-on position just within reach, not in front of him, not behind him, but ready, and Ava adjusted her direction without breaking stride, her voice low as she spoke into her phone. Visual confirmed, do not approach from front, he is scanning. And the response came instantly, agents repositioning around the perimeter, closing in without collapsing the space too quickly, because timing now mattered more than presence, and Brooks felt the shift again, this time sharper. The awareness that this moment was not about stopping someone unaware, it was about outthinking someone who was already anticipating them, and Ava stepped closer, her pace steady, her expression unchanged, blending into the environment in a way that made her presence almost invisible, and for a second everything slowed, the noise fading, the movement around them becoming distant, because this was the moment where one wrong step could break everything, and she stopped just a few feet away, her eyes locking onto the man's without hesitation, without challenge, just recognition, and in that silent exchange something passed between them, not words, not gestures, but understanding, because he knew, and she knew that he knew, and that was when the balance shifted again, not toward control, not toward chaos, but toward something far more fragile, precision, and Ava spoke, her voice calm, measured, "You are done." And the words did not echo, they settled, carrying a certainty that did not invite resistance, and Brooks stood just behind her, watching, not stepping in, not interrupting, because now he understood the difference between action and timing, and the man's grip on the carry-on tightened for the briefest moment before easing, his posture shifting just enough to signal that the moment had reached its conclusion, not through force, not through confrontation, but through inevitability. And as agents quietly moved into position around them, the terminal continued its steady rhythm, unaware that another critical moment had just passed, and Ava held her focus until the situation fully settled, until the final piece of the pattern was no longer moving, and only then did she step back slightly, the tension releasing in a way that was almost invisible to anyone not watching closely, and Brooks exhaled slowly, realizing that what he had just witnessed was not just resolution. It was control of a different kind, the kind that did not come from authority, but from understanding exactly when and how to act. And as the agents took over, Ava turned away, already moving forward, because for her, even this moment was not the end. It was simply the final confirmation of something that had been set in motion long before any of them had noticed, and now, finally, brought to light. The movement around Gate C-19 returned to its ordinary rhythm almost instantly, as if the moment that had just passed had been quietly folded back into the fabric of the airport, unseen and unacknowledged by the hundreds of travelers continuing toward their destinations, and Ava Carter stepped away from the center of it with the same calm precision she had carried into it, her posture steady, her breathing controlled, but her eyes already shifting forward, already searching beyond what had just been resolved, because she knew something that most people in that terminal never would, that moments like this were never truly isolated. They were signals, echoes of something larger that did not always reveal itself all at once. And behind her the agents completed their work with quiet efficiency, the final piece of the pattern now contained, the immediate threat neutralized without disruption, without panic, without anyone even realizing how close the situation had come to unfolding differently. And Officer Brooks stood there for a second longer, watching the space where everything had just happened, trying to hold on to the details, the timing, the precision, the way Ava had moved through it all without hesitation, without needing to raise her voice or assert control in the way he once believed was necessary. And he turned slowly, his gaze finding her again as she walked away, not waiting, not pausing, because for her there was no moment to stand still, only the next step, the next question. The next unseen detail waiting to be understood, and he followed, closing the distance just enough to speak, his voice quieter now, shaped by something deeper than before. "It is over, right?" he asked, not out of certainty, but out of hope, the kind that comes after witnessing something you do not fully understand. And Ava slowed slightly, just enough to acknowledge the question, her expression unchanged, her focus still forward, and she shook her head once, small, controlled. "It is contained," she said, and the distinction settled immediately, because contained did not mean finished. It did not mean complete. It meant managed, held in place for now, and Brooks absorbed that. The difference between what he had always thought his role was and what it actually meant in a world where outcomes were rarely final. And Ava continued walking, her voice calm, but carrying a quiet weight. "Patterns like this do not end. They shift," she said. And as they moved back into the flow of the terminal, the lights, the sounds, the movement all returning to what seemed like normal, Brooks realized that normal was only ever an illusion, a surface that hid layers of complexity he had never truly seen before. And Ava paused briefly near a large window overlooking the runway, planes taxiing in the distance under a sky that gave no indication of what had just been prevented inside those walls. And she looked out for a moment, not with relief, not with satisfaction, but with focus, as if already anticipating the next move, the next disruption, the next signal that would require her attention. And then she turned away, already stepping forward again, leaving Brooks standing there with a realization that would stay with him far longer than the events of that day, that the world he thought he understood was only a fraction of what actually existed, and that sometimes the difference between control and chaos was not power, not authority, but the ability to see what others never even noticed was there. The airport did not remember what had happened. It never did. It simply moved forward, planes lifting into the sky, new passengers arriving, announcements repeating like nothing had ever been interrupted, and Ava Carter walked through it all without slowing, her figure blending into the current of movement as if she had always been part of it. And maybe she had, just not in the way anyone else understood, because while others saw departures and arrivals, delays and destinations, she saw something entirely different, patterns forming beneath the surface, decisions being made in silence, moments that could shift everything without ever being noticed. And behind her, Officer Brooks remained still for a second longer, watching the space where she had just been, trying to hold on to the feeling of clarity that had replaced his earlier certainty, because it was not just about what he had done, it was about what he had failed to see, and that realization stayed with him, heavier than any consequence could have been, because it did not come from punishment, it came from truth. And Ava reached the edge of the terminal where the noise softened slightly, the glass walls reflecting a sky that looked calm, unchanged, untouched by everything that had just unfolded inside. And she paused for just a fraction of a second, not to rest, not to reflect, but to align herself with what came next. Because for her there was always a next, always another signal waiting to be understood, another pattern waiting to be uncovered. And she adjusted her coat, her expression steady, her focus already shifting beyond this place, beyond this moment. And Brooks finally moved, stepping forward as if pulled by something he could not fully explain, not to stop her, not to question her, but to carry something forward, something he had learned too late, but would not forget again. And Ava did not turn. She did not need to, because some things did not require acknowledgement to be understood. And as she continued walking, disappearing into the endless motion of the airport, the weight of what had happened did not follow her. It stayed behind, settling into the space she had left, into the people who had witnessed it, into the quiet shift that would change the way at least one person saw the world from that day forward. And Brooks stood there, his eyes scanning the crowd, not out of suspicion, not out of control, but out of awareness, asking a question he had never asked before. Not who looks wrong, but what am I missing? And somewhere beyond the glass, beyond the runway, beyond the reach of that single moment, the world continued to move in ways no one could fully predict. But one thing had changed, something small, something quiet, something that would echo long after the details faded, because he thought he was the one enforcing the rules. But that day, he learned that the real power did not come from a badge. It came from the ability to see the truth before it was too late.